obviously to share. So.
Perfect. All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the Fairvote Canada webinar on proportional representation. We're just going to give people a few minutes to arrive. It's great to see a really strong registration for this. Maybe lots of people interested after the Ontario election. I hope everybody saw our op-ed today in the Toronto Star, written by Alex Himmelfarb. He did a fantastic job for us. And so this is like a perfect time to talk about how to move the dial forward in Ontario and federally. So everybody's good after just a couple minutes patience while people join us, and that way they don't miss some important things. It'll only be like another minute, Tom, and then we'll get started. So for those of you who are just joining us, the chat box is for you to chat with other people who are on this webinar. And the Q&A box is where you put your questions for Dennis. So if you put your questions in the chat box, Dennis is not going to get them. We're going to be looking at the Q&A box and answering as many as we can and the most relevant questions that we can after Dennis gives his presentation. We also have Jen here, who is going to be helping us in the chat box. And this is just you feel free to say hello and where you're joining us from today. It's great to see there's already almost 130 people joining us. Awesome. So I just want to give everybody a little friendly reminder that the reason we run these sort of introductory sessions is for new people. And we know that there are people on here as well who have been with us forever. Please don't geek out too much in the chat, because imagine being a new person to this and having this really long technical discussion between a couple of people. So let's try to keep this as inclusive and for everybody as we possibly can. And there's other places that you can get into those sort of weeds. All right, super. Somebody joining us from Saskatchewan. A couple people from Saskatchewan. Hello, Riel, and hello, Sarah from Winnipeg. Nice. Okay, just going to give it about less than another minute, and then we will get started. Okay. All right, so we're going to get started now so that everybody who has already joined doesn't have to wait any longer. So for everybody probably knows me. For those of you who don't, my name is Anita. I'm the Executive Director of Fairvote Canada. And Fairvote Canada is a national citizens campaign for proportional representation. And we are joined today by Associate Professor Dennis Pilon. So Dennis is going to give a PowerPoint presentation. He's going to cover quite a lot of things, some of the about what PR is, some of the myths, facts, and how we should be framing this debate. And while he's talking, you can be writing your questions in the question box for Dennis. Please don't use the chat for that. Use the chat to talk to each other. Use the question box for your questions for Dennis. Before we get started with Dennis's presentation, I'd like to just acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and Neutral Peoples, now known as Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario. Okay, Dennis, do you want to share your screen?
I do. All right, let me get my screen sharing here. I think this is the right one. And we will, here we go, play from the start. Now, let me know if it isn't working or if things don't show up the way they should. Sometimes we do get sort of different glitches. Yeah, this one's doing something kind of weird already. Well, look, let me start by thanking everybody for coming out tonight. Wow, what a great crowd of people, and from all across the country. This is fantastic. Thanks for spending your Sunday evening with us. I'm going to try to run through some of our greatest hits on this topic and raise some, I think, some key issues. I'm obviously not going to cover everything. And I'd just like to remind you that I'm going to do my presentation, try not to take up all our time, then leave things open for you to pitch your questions and interests. But, if we don't get to your question, or if I don't answer it, enough, you're not happy with the answer, remember, you can always contact me directly. So you can just email me, or we'll put my email into the chat, and you can email me with any questions. And at the end, I'll also show you my Academia EDU site, where you can see all my research and even read a free copy of my book on the topic. So hopefully there'll be lots of answers, lots of things that you'll find interesting in tonight's presentation. So the talk I've called How to Understand Voting System Reform and Act on It. So there's the two pieces. And here are the things that I want to take up as the themes. So we'll start with what? What is a voting system? Now, for some of you, you already know this, so maybe go put the kettle on and relax for a minute or two while I run over some of the basics for the newbies, right? For the people who are just joining us, who just discovered voting systems and proportional representation. I'm just going to run through some basic verbiage, some terms to help you get up to speed. And then I want to shift to how do we talk about voting systems, and why does that matter? Why does it matter the way we talk about it? Then I'm going to shift to what I call fake values versus real voters. So in other words, how should we take up this problem? And then I also want to address the referendum question, because that's come up repeatedly. Do we need a referendum? I say no. And I'll give you some reasons about why I think the call for referendums is rather duplicitous and not really supported by any kind of clear democratic theory. Okay, let's start with what. What is a voting system? Well, at the most basic level, you can break down every single voting system used around the world into three basic parts. Each voting system has three working parts. They have a ballot design, they have a districting rule, and they have a formula. Now, the ballot design is the way you mark the ballot. Do you just make an X or a check mark on it like we typically do in Canadian elections? Or do you make an ordinal marking? Do you rank your choices 1, 2, 3, 4? So those are the two basic choices in terms of ballot design. And every voting system has a choice there. Then every voting system has a districting rule. How many people are going to get elected in any particular district? Now, of course, mostly we use single member districts for Canadian elections, though we do have some municipal elections that have multi-member districts. Now, I can see someone's raised a hand. I'm just going to suggest we're going to take some questions at the end, so just hang on to those questions. It's quite possible that I'll answer your question as I go forward in my slides, but if I don't, hang on to it. I'll definitely want to come to it later. All right. And then the other aspect is what we call formula. And this is basically, how do you decide who wins? What's the mathematical thing that you apply to make a decision about who gets to win in a particular area? And here we have three different typical formulas. The plurality formula, which basically says you get more votes than anyone else. There's the majority formula, so you got to get a majority of the votes in a particular area. And then we have various proportional formulas. So you don't have to get a plurality or majority, you just have to get a proportion of the votes. And as I say, all voting systems combine the choices on these three elements, and it can lead to some confusion. For instance, as I'll point out in a moment, there are a number of different voting systems that have ranking opportunities. So they're not the same. We have, for instance, what we call the alternative vote. I'll talk about that in a moment. And that uses a ranked ballot. It's a majority voting system. But then we can also see the same ranking opportunity in proportional systems like the single transferable vote. So you don't need to know all these details necessarily. I know for some of you, you find these things very interesting, but it can be useful just as background. So that's why I'm going through it. Okay, so the three working parts, all voting systems comprise that. Then we've got three basic kinds of voting systems themselves. So all the voting systems in the world can basically be sorted into containers three ways. We've got winner take all voting systems. Those are like our first past the post voting system, or some of the majority voting systems, the alternative vote is an example. Then we've got proportional representation. And there's a couple of different examples of proportional representation. And then we've got what's called semi-proportional systems. So these are systems that, they kind of look like proportional representation, but they don't really create proportional results. And so there's a number of systems that fall into that category. So three different kinds. And then we've got three historic alternatives that we've heard in Canada as a choice for single member plurality. Now, technically, of course, what I meant here was I was addressing mostly the PR options. Of course, some people have suggested that some of these majority systems are an option, but I'm leaving those aside. The three historic alternatives to the present voting system is party list proportional representation, and single transferable vote, and the mixed member proportional systems. These are the three. Now, recently, we've heard some people propose even more options in Canada. I don't want to neglect those necessarily, but these are the three systems that have been used around the world in most Western countries. So the ones we tend to talk about. Let me show you where some of these systems are used. So here's a table from one of my books that gives you an idea of which countries use what systems. So if we're looking at plurality voting systems, one of the winner-take-all systems, then we've got single and multi-member, and we can see that countries like Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom all use plurality voting systems. They tend to use the single-member plurality system for national and subnational elections, and then they tend to use the multi-member approach sometimes in local elections. Now, I'll just note that the United Kingdom is an exception to this rule, because now they also use proportional systems in some of their devolved assemblies and also for some of their local elections. What about majority voting systems? This is one of the winner-take-all systems. And here we've got two key examples. Recently, of course, we saw the election in France. That's what's called a majority runoff system. They have an election. Somebody doesn't win a majority, they have another election in 2 weeks to see if the top two vote getters will battle it out. The other approach is called the alternative vote, and that's the system that's used for the elections in Australia's lower house. Now, don't worry, there won't be a quiz later. I'm not expecting you to remember all these details. I'm just throwing them out there. Maybe you've heard of some of them, maybe you haven't. And then, of course, the proportional systems. And here you can see the three key examples that I was talking about. The party list systems are used in places like Sweden and Norway. Historically, it was used in places like Italy, though not recently. Well, actually, they've come back to it recently in Italy. The mixed member proportional system is the system used in Germany and New Zealand. That's where they have a local member. It looks much like our system, but then they add on a party list to make the results look proportional overall. And then there's the single transferable vote system. That's the system that's used in Ireland, been used there for over 100 years. It's also, it's a system that we actually have used quite extensively in Canada at the provincial and municipal level. And then I've given you some examples of some of these semi-proportional systems. I'm not going to go into the details of these ones, but you can see that these semi-proportional systems have been used and are being used presently, actually, in a number of places around the world. Okay. So I just wanted to give you a really basic overview of the systems and how they work and why we combine the different elements together, how we understand that. Now I want to move on to how we talk about voting systems and why it matters. And here we've got a dominant view, which is the view that is used by most academics and media analysts and politicians when they talk about voting systems, when there's a public discussion of voting systems. They tend to present voting systems as a preference, that the decision should be made on the basis of the things that people like. And I argue that this approach is not the right way to approach the question. And so I challenge that with what I call the democratization approach, which is the approach that we use in Fair Vote Canada and also informs the historical research that I've done. So in the preference approach, we hear that voting system reform is about competing values, and that all voting system choices are okay, they're all valid. It just depends on what you prefer. And so if you prefer having a local member, if you prefer having legislative majority governments, well, then, first past the post is the right system for you. And they argue that depending on where people's preferences are, that's how they should make their decision. Now, the democratization approach, on the other hand, says that we don't make decisions about institutions on the basis of these preferences, but rather we make it on the basis of trying to understand what we think people are doing when they're voting. What are they trying to accomplish? And then we adapt the institutions to let people do what they're trying to do. That's the best way to do voting system reform. And this is what we call the democratization approach. Well, I argue that we can see the weakness of the preference approach by looking at the lack of evidence that, that those who propose it typically put forward, which is not very much. And as I run through these, I think for some of you, you'll hear things that sound familiar. These are often the key arguments that we hear in defense of our current system or against changing the system. And as I'll demonstrate, though in fairly brief manner, the evidence supporting these claims is very, very weak. So these are the four values that we often hear talked about when people defend our current system, when people make claims about why we should keep it or why we shouldn't change it to something else. So we hear people argue about simplicity, about stability, about representation, and about accountability. And again, I'm just going to run through these briefly to give you a sense of why I think these arguments are not terribly compelling. Let's deal with the simplicity argument first. We often hear that our current voting system is simple compared to the alternatives. And that PR systems, proportional representation, are complex. So, and they argue that this is a value. Some people like simplicity, and if they like simplicity, they should keep our current system. Well, when we turn to evidence, what we discover is that PR, while complicated to count, is not actually complicated to use. And we know this by looking at what we call ballot spoilage rates. In other words, how often do people make a mistake marking their ballot? That's one way we can judge whether or not the system is too complicated for people to use. And what we discover is that, yeah, PR systems are not complicated. In fact, their ballot spoilage rates are comparable to the ballot spoilage rates with our own system. So neither system produces a lot of spoiled ballots. Now, when they talk about how simple our current voting system is, they're often just referring to the counting process. Understanding how our system works is not simple. And if you ask someone, well, how did Doug Ford turn 40% of the votes into 60, 70% of the seats in this last Ontario provincial election? I pretty much guarantee you very few people you meet will be able to explain that to you. In fact, research on how people understood the relationship between majority governments and not majority governments showed that when people hear the term majority government, they almost always think that it's a majority of people voting for it and supporting it. But some of you may know that almost never occurs. Very seldom do our governments, whether they're provincial or federal, enjoy a majority of the voting support. That is created by the voting system. And yet many people mistake those results, which again just suggests that the system is not as simple as we've been led to believe. What about stability? We've heard that our current voting system is stable, while PR systems are not. And the argument here is that single-member plurality systems are stable because they involve just one government, usually a single government in power, a single party, whereas PR systems often involve coalitions governing. Again, what's the evidence? Well, the evidence does not support the claim. Coalition and minority governments in comparable Western countries using PR are not, in fact, unstable. One of the ways we can judge this is we can look and see whether they've had more elections than we've had in the same amount of time. If they have to keep going back to the voters because they can't keep the government alive, that would suggest they were unstable. But in fact, they've had fewer elections than we've had in a similar amount of time. And so again, the arguments for stability and instability are not supported by the evidence. What about representation? One of the key claims that we hear about our current system is that local representation is terribly important and that we can't allow any change to take place in that. And we also hear that representation in these other systems allows small parties to have too much influence. Again, when we look at the evidence of what voters actually do, we discover that very few vote on the basis of their local identity. Interesting study asked people, how important is your local representative to you in your vote? 40% of the people said, yes, terribly important. But then the researchers asked another question. They said, well, what if the person in your local area wasn't with the party you support. Well, now only 4% were prepared to say that voting for the local person was terribly important. We know that under our current system, voting for the local person is not terribly important to voters because candidates who have a primarily local identity never win. When they do win, they're almost always connected to a political party, right? There's someone who had a falling out with their party and then ran as an independent. Now, the arguments about small party influence, again, are often claims that are made, but seldom supported by looking at what occurs in countries using PR systems. In countries that use PR systems, it doesn't appear that small parties have too much influence. I mean, they have some influence, but then some would say in a democracy, that's only fair. What about accountability? Some people argue that one of the great benefits of our current system is that it delivers accountability. The voters know who to blame. Right? They've got a clear idea of who was in power, and they can't dodge responsibility for what they've done. This approach to accountability is kind of weird because it doesn't recognize how voters actually make decisions. Voters make decisions on the basis of the policy differences that exist between different parties. Now, some voters are all over the map and they change their views all the time, but a lot of voters do have a kind of sense of politics that they're chasing. And so it doesn't make any sense to argue that, say, right-wing voters are going to make their party accountable by booting them from power and putting in a left-wing party. That just doesn't make any sense. And so this idea that our current system gives voters so much power, it just doesn't match up with what voters really do in elections. If anything, PR systems offer that kind of accountability because often voters have more than one choice when it comes to, say, a right-wing party or a right of center party or a left-wing party or a centrist party. And so in that sense, this accountability argument actually makes more sense. Well, I think that these arguments about values are often really kind of fake values because, as I say, they're not supported by evidence. They're not supported by what voters actually do and what occurs in countries that use these different systems. So how should we judge a system? How should we try to figure out what's going on? My argument is that the best way to assess whether institutions are working is to try to figure out what voters are trying to do when they vote. So it's not a question of saying, well, what do you prefer? It's a question of analyzing what's going on in the political system. And I mean, you could go and ask people and they'd give you lots of different answers. But really the most reliable information that we have about what voters are trying to accomplish is to look at their votes. Their votes tell us a lot. And what we find out is that voters are voting for party. Even voters who say they hate parties are still voting for parties because voting for parties is a kind of collective action, a solution. As I've suggested, there's not a lot of evidence to support the idea that voters vote on the basis that they're local person, except as a kind of post hoc rationalization. You know, they kind of decide, oh, I like that person. They've already decided they're going to like them because they're with the party that they support. And there's some really kind of common sense reasons that parties dominate our system. Part of it is that parties act as what we call an information shortcut for voters. You know, voters have busy lives. They can't keep up with all of the stuff that's going on in politics. So parties are a way for them to figure out what's going on. When we have political systems without parties, it's very hard for voters to figure out what everybody stands for, which is why voter turnout in local elections is often much, much lower. It's simply too hard for voters to sort out all the competing independent candidates and figure out where they stand. So that is the challenge to which parties have become a solution. You know, people are often angry with parties, upset with them, but the answer isn't necessarily to get rid of parties, but to make parties more accountable to the people that want to support them. And that's part of the argument we're making with voting system reform, is that we can use it to make those parties more accountable. What about a referendum? I'm not going to go into all the details of my argument on this because I don't want to take up too much of our time together. I want to make sure we've got lots of time to discuss the things that you want to talk about. But here, I just want to point out some things about the arguments that are made around referendums. Because often the arguments about referendums aren't even arguments, they're just assertions. There's an assumption that we have to have a referendum, that having a referendum is the most democratic thing to do. But I just remind you that using a referendum to make decisions about representation is the oldest anti-democratic trick in the book. It's been used against every group that was trying to get into the political system, whether we're talking about working class voters in the 19th and early 20th century, or votes for women in the early 20th century, or the fate of Black voters across the United States of America throughout its history. I mean, the 1965 Voting Rights Act was implemented in part to stop states from using things like referendums to deny Black people their voting rights. So just because you have a vote on it doesn't necessarily make it democratic. If we understand what we're doing as a fight for democratic inclusion, then people's right to democratic inclusion is not something that you put to a vote. It's also important to recognize that referendums are not the way that most voting systems have been designed and implemented. When we look at the question historically, we find that only Switzerland introduced its voting system by referendum in 1918. And that wasn't changed really until very recently when New Zealand joined that club. Even amongst the recent voting system reforms, New Zealand and the referendum is an outlier. Countries like Italy and Japan have changed their voting system without a referendum. We've seen 10 voting systems at the provincial level in this country. We've seen 10 provincial voting system reforms, not one with a referendum. They have occurred simply by a legislative change. And here, I would just like to underline that often when people call for a referendum, they cloak their claims in democratic substance, but really it's partisan self-interest. And so we see certain parties like the Conservatives leaning on the referendum because they feel pretty confident that they can win it. And of course, they also rig the game with things like supermajority rules and other sorts of things that make sure that their interests won't be threatened. We also know that referendums are often just a waste of time because they just tend to reproduce opinions that are held by the parties. The voters don't know a lot about institutions, and that's not their fault. They've got busy lives. But what we see going on in referendums is kind of like what we see going on in elections themselves. You know, voters use party as a proxy for their own intimate information about a topic. And while I guess that many of you here, are really interested in voting systems, the average person is not. And so they will look to their party to get direction, which means that the referendum results are just a reflection of what the parties already thought on the topic. So why waste the time with the referendum? The other thing I would underline is that the introduction of our past voting systems was not a terribly democratic exercise. Referendums were not part of it. Public consultation was not part of it. The process by which we have come to use the voting systems that we have in Canada are largely an elite measure, introduced or held in place by those who are often unwillingly opening the political system to new participants. And when they did, they didn't offer those people a chance to change the institutions. No, they kept the institutions in place that they thought would continue to benefit them. Let me wrap up my comments. Here's my big pitch about why referendums are not appropriate for a question like voting system reform. We have heard that voting system reform is a question of values. Well, I've walked through the values that we've heard, and most of them are not supported. It's not about local representation or majority government or any of these other things that we often hear. There's no evidence to support those claims. What is supported is that voting system reform is about representation. It is about a claim for representation, a claim for inclusion. So if you're going to have a referendum, then what you're really saying is, do you want more or less inclusion? Do you think we should have more or less inclusion? And there's something quite normatively suspect about that position. It's not a terribly democratic one. The way I pitched it in an op-ed in the Vancouver Sun back in 2017, before the NDP, the provincial government had made a decision about it, I said, look, here's the problem. The people who say we have to have a referendum, this is the logic of what they're saying. And here's the quote. You arrive at a neighbor's house for a friendly game of cards, but at the door, he tells you that the other players have decided that you'll have to score twice as many points as everyone else to win the game. But hey, it's all above board, he says, because most of the players voted in favor of the rule. So does that make the rules fair? Would anyone agree to play a game under these terms? Of course we wouldn't. Of course it's not fair. And yet this is the very thing that the referendum proponents are basically saying. All right. Well, to conclude, I put some of the details of voting systems out there for you. They matter, but they don't matter nearly as much as the reasons that different people support or oppose changing our voting systems. How we talk about voting system reform is important, because if we give in to the preference side, then we grant credibility to a host of claims that in fact have no evidence to support them. I argue that attempts to introduce these other values into the discussion are either a distraction or just another form of politicking. They're not supported by facts. And referendums, I've suggested, are not the way to make institutions more democratic. Now, I'll just remind you that you can follow up on any of the things that I've talked about, looking at any of my publications. My research is all available for free on my Academia EDU site, including my book, The Politics of Voting, which looks at the Canadian case and offers many of the arguments that I've made with you tonight. All right, so that's all from me for a presentation. Let's turn things over to you and your questions and concerns.
Thank you, Dennis. That's wonderful. And you packed a whole bunch into a really short time. So now we'll be able to dig in a little bit deeper in the questions. So I've printed some of them off just so they're easier for me to see. And the first question is the one that we always get and could take a very long time if we really wanted to get into it. How can we implement the change if governments are unwilling? Do you want to take a crack at that, Dennis?
Well, I mean, this is the $64 million question, right? And all I can do is say that history sometimes offers us some insight into how it has happened in other places at other times, or in this place at other times. I think pitching it as a democratic struggle is important, because some people have this idea that our political system was designed at some point, that, everybody sat down and said, hey, Canada, we should be a democracy. Oh, how should we do that? No. That's not what happened, okay? We have gone from a period of non-democracy to kind of a little more democratic, but still not terribly democratic. And so we are constantly fighting to try to put more substance into our democracy. So the short answer is only by creating more and more pressure, only by contributing to the legitimacy crisis that our present system is suffering from, can we create the conditions where it will be very difficult for these elites not to move forward on these sorts of questions. Taking advantage of unpredictable events. That has been the case in many other places where, situations have kind of spiraled out of control of the powers that be, and that has created an opportunity. And our job is to try to keep people focused, keep them focused on the most important thing, which is changing to some form of proportional representation, breaking the back of these phony majority governments, which are responsible for many of the ills that people are unhappy with. Opening up the political system to more accurate representation, a more genuinely competitive democratic opportunity. That's the way that we tame the political system and bring it more in line with the democratic values that we hold.
I just want to add too, there is simply no magic way to get around the politicians. So if you came looking for a magic answer, it's not there. All I can say is that we have to keep building, keep growing, and take advantage of every single opportunity and use every opportunity to the max. And that's why Fair Vote Canada exists, is to organize people to use those opportunities, such as the recent Ontario election. And I was watching a program on TVO the other day with Steve Paikin, and he had former premiers of Ontario on there. And I heard Dalton McGuinty, not my favorite PR guy, for those that know the history, but he said something that really stuck with me, and I want to share it with you all. He said, when you think that you'll be physically ill if you say it one more time, that's when people are hearing it for the first time. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so that is advice to all of us in the PR movement. Keep saying it, keep repeating it, because that's how we keep growing.
And Anita, just quickly, people should remember that New Zealand changed its voting system. It took about 30 years to accomplish, and it was accomplished in part by a series of flukes and accidents and unpredictable events. So again, just reinforcing this idea that there's no roadmap, there's only the unpredictable. And part of what we're doing is organizing to try to, grasp those opportunities if they emerge.
Yeah. Okay, so the next question I saw, this is a little bit technical, but maybe you can just speak in general here. Where mixed member proportional is in place, how is the number of list seats determined? Maybe you can just talk about how people are elected in the proportional systems for Canada in a general way.
I think the concern that is behind so many of the ideas around these other systems is, are they democratic? Are they accountable? Are they controllable? Sure, we can look at examples in different periods and see where things are going on we might not like. But because those systems are more competitive, more open to new political players, it means that new political players with new ideas, with new values, can sometimes enter the system and force a change on the system. It's why, for instance, PR systems in Western countries moved much more quickly on representing women than other places. It's not that their public values were that different. It was that their political systems were more competitive. And when one party said, you know what, we're going to make getting women elected a priority, it created a contagion effect to the other parties. Well, that's true on a host of other issues too, in terms of how parties operate. Now, in terms of how the number of seats, in some cases it's set. So in some cases, there is a set number of seats. In New Zealand, there's a set number of seats, and a certain number are local ridings and a certain number are party list. In Germany, it's somewhat flexible. And so they have what's called an overhang. And the overhang can go, can increase and decrease depending on how out of whack the results are in the lower house. If the lower house, or I'm sorry, in the single member riding part, if the single member riding part results are too unproportional, it may be that the party list number of seats won't be able to correct the problem and create total proportionality. So the German system allows them to do that, but the New Zealand system does not. So there's always a lot of nuance in the details, even though they're both mixed member proportional systems, but depending on what the politics is going on in those different places, they may have different rules to address it.
Right. And this kind of thing is one of the reasons that Fair Vote Canada for the past several years has been pushing for a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform. Because when Dennis was talking, as fascinating as he is, if you started to kind of glaze over a little bit, that's what people do. And that's what we don't want to be doing out there in the public. What we want to be doing is promoting a process that people can trust, because trust is so much more important than any little mechanical detail of a system. I have another question here. What is the type of representational government, I think they mean electoral reform, that the Liberal government would support?
Oh, I think we know the answer to this. The Liberals have, if they support electoral reform, they support the alternative vote, a majority system. They support a system where voters could make a second choice to avoid, strategic voting. That's the system that they support. The problem is that system is not all that much different than the current system we use. It's not going to give us the improvements that we need to make the system more accountable.
Yeah. So just to give you an idea, Australia is the only OECD country that uses that system, and they just had an election where the majority government has 32.6% of the vote. So it does a great job at funneling the voices of the third and smaller parties into two big tents. And so if you want a sort of a unrepresentative two-party system, that's the way to go. That's sort of the opposite of what Fair Vote Canada is trying to achieve. I have a question about Israel. Maybe I just need to say the word Israel. There you go, Dennis.
What is the question about Israel?
Well, they're having a lot of elections.
Yeah. Okay. So, we have seen most recently in Israel a succession of electoral events, which of course contributes to this view that PR is unstable. All I would say is this: Israel has used PR since its founding in the early 1950s. In that time, from the 1950s up to the 1980s, the early 1980s, it was dominated by one party, the Labour Party. The Labour Party was a part of every single coalition government that existed in Israel. Up until recently, Israel had fewer elections than Canada. So, we're talking about a country that has now 70 years of experience with voting system reform. This is what we call a sampling problem. When you pick out the example that makes your case, then you're not actually being fair to the facts. And so the argument around PR is not that there will never, ever be a political crisis or that there won't be difficulties that countries have to go through. I mean, we've seen a succession of elections at different times here in Canada in the 60s and in the aughts, and now more recently around governments. So, no system is necessarily going to prevent that. What's interesting is that in Israel, we've only really seen the succession of elections very, very recently.
Okay, so I have a question from Riel. He's saying one could say you take a realist approach to electoral reform. He's talking about the fact that we would like politicians to acknowledge that they are in a conflict of interest and agree to a process. What are your comments on how to achieve this shift?
Well, I mean, I think, the politicking is always about the shame game, and we are attempting to, in some ways, use our normative claims around what our voting system isn't doing, how many people are not getting represented, the way in which it's not matching what voters are saying with their votes. And we're attempting to put them into a corner where they have little option but to, move on the thing that we want. The idea of the Citizens Assembly is a two-step process. So in that sense, we're not asking them necessarily to commit to a new system. We're saying commit to a process. That's the way we've worked, throughout the last 20 years of Fair Vote Canada often, is to say commit to the process. The difficulty we've had is that the politicians have been very wily, and they've come up with ways to rig the process so that change is highly unlikely. I'm of the view, I'm tired of playing the values game that they want to play. I think that we need to call out our current voting system as patently undemocratic. I mean, it's just wacky that we're using the system that so tortures the election results. I mean, in what other scenario would you sit down with people and agree to use this kind of system? In fact, there's a mathematical professor, Michael Dummett, who's written on voting theory. Now, for the most part, I don't find this stuff that useful to our topic, but Michael Dummett has a great quote where he says, yeah, show me a group of people who are making a decision for the first time about how to set up their political system. How many of them choose this single member plurality system? Zero, right? If you look at countries emerging from the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, how many chose first past the post? Zero, right? Look at the recent, the democratizing countries in the 1970s, Greece, Spain, Portugal. How many chose first past the post? Zero. I mean, this is not what people do, rational people do, when they can make a choice for themselves about how to represent themselves in a political system. It's only ever a holdover by a pre-democratic or anti-democratic elite who want to maintain power under these new democratic conditions.
Okay, so we have a question about the media. So this is sort of specific. Do you think there's any interest in the media for some adult conversation about the topic while we're having downtime over the summer? But maybe you could just comment on the media environment on our issue in general and how to deal with that.
Well, it's funny. I mean, of course, many people look at the way that I take up the question, and I'm seen to be, kind of an extreme Democrat, compared to the more sober political scientists. But even a sober political scientist like Larry Leduc from the University of Toronto, in his analysis of the 2007 referendum in Ontario, said, well, the no campaign was basically the media. And that echoed my research on the 2007 media treatment of the topic. The media have been implacably opposed to voting system reform for the most part. I mean, there's been a few exceptions here and there, a few more open people, a couple of open commentators. But if you go through and you look at the number of national daily newspapers and you look at the number of columnists supporting as opposed to opposed, this is a completely tipped discussion. The major media have mostly lined up behind the Conservative Party and to some extent the Liberal Party in saying every kind of false claim about voting systems and voting system reform that you can imagine. So that's been a major problem. Now, just recently, I don't know, hell froze over or something happened, but the Toronto Star, allegedly our progressive alternative for media in the country, actually changed its position, its editorial position in favor of proportional representation. For the longest time, Star, no appeal to reason could get through to them because, of course, what you need to understand is that often the media talking points are just a way of pursuing their own political agenda. And of course, the Star's position was that the way to solve Canada's problems is simply vote Liberal, right? If everybody would just vote Liberal, then all the problems would be solved at the provincial and federal level, and we don't need any of this voting system reform. Now that it appears that voting Liberal isn't quite getting the results that they want, they seem to be open to talking about this issue, which of course we should take advantage of.
Yeah, so for anybody joining us that isn't aware, the Toronto Star, after the Ontario election, about a week later came out with their editorial board saying they endorse proportional representation specifically, which is like a huge shift, a huge change for us, like a major breakthrough. Just for Ontario, you understand. Okay, but it still reaches millions of people that we can't reach. So it's really hopeful. What it says to me, for everybody wondering, what do we do? The next 3 years, 4 years of the Conservative majority in Ontario are as an opportunity to influence the parties. And this window we have with that situation and with the Toronto Star probably will not last forever. So we need to make the very best use of it that we can while it's here. Somebody has a question about voter apathy, voter turnout. I saw a couple. Will proportional representation have impact on voter apathy, voter turnout? What do you think?
Well, again, it's a very large topic. Voter turnout is one of the most researched topics in political science. Literally thousands of articles have been written on the topic in the last 30 years. And there's no consensus amongst political scientists about what the hell has happened to voter turnout. Why have we gone from 80% voter turnout in the 1950s to 50% voter turnout presently? I think the answer is maybe. Maybe it kind of makes sense that a proportional system would create incentives for people to participate. If people who feel like their vote's wasted or it doesn't make any difference, they might feel more motivated. Research that's been done in New Zealand found some really interesting things. For instance, it found out that people who felt their vote was wasted or felt unrepresented were much more motivated to vote, and so their voter turnout went up. Unfortunately, the gains were erased by those who were motivated by the winner take all. Oh my God, rush to the barricades. One vote could make a difference. That kind of logic of crisis motivated a number of voters who seemed less motivated under PR in New Zealand, where the fact it's not going to be like that. It's not going to add up that way. So yeah, I think what we need to do is not overstate claims. The issue of voter turnout is a very complicated one, and PR is probably not going to solve it all on its own, but it could contribute to altering. I think the evidence is that people who felt excluded historically are more likely to vote under PR. People who've been more privileged under our system may find less incentive.
It's an interesting way to look at it. Thank you, Dennis. I hadn't actually thought of it like that before. So somebody is writing in about minority governments, just pointing out that we've had so many minority governments recently at the federal level in Canada, and that they tend to be unstable because obviously after a couple of elections, somebody wants to have another one, and he wants to know, how do PR countries deal with this? Is there some sort of rule or procedure that they don't have these elections all the time?
Great question. And I think it's a really important distinction, because minority governments under first past the post are much more unstable than minority governments under PR. Why? Because it's like gambling. It's like the one-armed bandit, right? You come to an election, Mr. Trudeau says, well, maybe we can line up the magic ridings and turn, 35% into 55% of the seats. And of course, because first past the post does this weird alchemy with the votes, that you can get those kinds of results. So there's a strong incentive to try to get back to majority government, because particularly for Liberals and Conservatives, it's a key part of their politicking, to have that kind of control over government and to be able to deliver on various promises, particularly to special interest groups. Under PR, there's not going to be any magical change that occurs. It's highly unlikely. And so there's no reward for going back to the public before you said you were going to. In fact, governments that try to play those games under PR often get punished by the voters because they say, what are you doing? Why are you coming back to us already, right? You're supposed to have a 3-year or 4-year term. So it really matters. The erratic, but somewhat predictable way that first past the post overrepresents these large parties creates a very powerful incentive for them to want to go back to the electorate. Whenever the polls suggest that their numbers are up and that they can turn their minority into a majority, they want to rush out and have an election. But if you switch to PR, that evaporates. Now there's no longer going to be any big gain, and so they're not going to be able to justify it.
And that's one of the reasons probably behind the research that Dennis has done showing that countries with PR don't have elections any more often than we do. Because the incentive to do that just evaporates.
Well, actually, in a comparison across Western industrialized countries in Canada, most PR countries have had fewer elections than we've had in a similar period of time. So, you know, that tells us something important.
It's hard for us to imagine here, like for those of you following a little bit what's been going on the last couple of years in Ireland, it's just to see the two giant parties, right? There's like the center party and the center right party who are historical enemies. Okay, come together and sign a coalition deal with the Green Party, the two big parties, like kind of like our Liberals and the old PCs, with the Green Party, a 5-year, 81-page deal where the two of them are basically going to take turns being their equivalent of prime minister. If you can't imagine that here, it's because we're so far away from that level of cooperation where those incentives exist, where people want to see parties work together and get something done, not, you know, when's the vote going to be again sort of thing, who's up, who's down. There's a big difference in culture. So I have a question. Let me see. Do you see any more, Dennis, where I'm...
You know, there are so many questions here. Wow.
I know.
And the debate in the chat, my goodness. I mean, wow, you people are really firing on all cylinders tonight. I just want to say, I know it's frustrating if you put in a question and we're not getting to it, not because we're trying to avoid it at all. And if you do want to follow up with me, I encourage you to do so. I'm chatty here and I'm chatty in email. So if you want to follow up with me, please do.
Anne had a good question. She wanted to know about how other countries have transitioned to proportional representation other than New Zealand. How did it happen?
So if we look at most Western industrialized countries, which are the countries that are most comparable to Canada, right? I mean, I noticed somebody put in a comment about Chile, and that's really interesting. It's great to, you know, be aware of what's happening in these other places. But of course, the economic and political development of Chile is quite different than Canada. The person there wasn't making a comparison to Canada, but I'm just using that as an example that we need to compare Canada and what's possible in Canada with other countries that share a similar kind of economic and political development. And that's why we often look at Western industrialized countries or Anglo-American countries, right? The United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, or, you know, Benelux countries, Holland, Belgium, you know, Germany, you know, the Sweden, you know, the Nordic countries. We use them as our comparator. And most of those countries changed their voting systems around World War I, and they changed it under the pressure of democratization. Basically, either they didn't have what we call responsible government, you know, a legislature that where the executive is accountable to the legislature, or they didn't have an open franchise. So they might have had a very narrow franchise, just, you know, men with property, as opposed to, say, you know, all working class men. And so there were battles going on and people rioting in the streets and, you know, we want democracy. And so they finally, during World War I, had to open up the political systems. And it's interesting that PR was adopted really as a conservative strategy, you know, to try to prevent these new voters from taking over the system, because, you know, the powers that be thought, well, they'll be just as selfish as we were, you know, but that's not what happened, actually. Working class voters didn't turn out to be one-dimensional in their views. And so it was one of those funny things where PR was brought in for, you know, not terribly principled reasons, but in the end turned out to be a pretty principled result in terms of the kinds of results that it produced. Now, the battle over democracy continued after that, and some countries went undemocratic. Germany, Italy, obviously. And then in the post-war period, we saw a restoration of democracy in those countries, and at the same time, a restoration of proportional voting in most cases. So that's what's gone on. More recently, we've seen voting system reform emerge. Well, it emerged in France for tactical reasons in the 1980s, introduced, quickly gotten rid of. It was introduced around corruption issues in Italy. Corruption played a big role in the changes that occurred in Japan in the 1990s. So there's a lot of I mean, these illustrate some of the things we were talking about earlier, that sometimes things totally unrelated to voting systems are the catalyst for moving voting system reform forward. And in the case of Italy and Japan, the degree of corruption that had been uncovered that was going on in the political system that touched most of the parties created the conditions where the political class had to embrace reform, just to retain any shred of credibility. And so, yeah, it really does underline the kind of social dimensions of reform. We're not just talking about a technical fix here. We're talking about the power in our society and how it's shared or not.
Yeah. So somebody's asking a question about anger, basically saying that people seem to be angry, and he's wondering if first past the post is feeding this anger due to regional divisions in Canada.
You know, all countries in, around the world, but certainly in Western countries, we've seen the rise of, kind of populist dog whistle politics. And part of that is a reflection of people's frustration. Brexit in the United Kingdom, or the election of Donald Trump in the United States. Some might say that some of the targets are somewhat misplaced, in that we heard claims about changes that were taking place in these countries economically, and everybody would benefit. Everybody would benefit from free trade. Everyone would benefit from a single market in Europe. But the truth of the matter is that not everyone's benefited equally. And lots of stats show that the rich have gotten richer and the poor have gotten poorer. And the gradations between there, we see a struggling working class, a slipping middle class, a bloated wealthy elite. And so, yeah, this has fueled a lot of anger, and some of it has landed on the parties. Some of it has landed on the institutions. Some of it is lashing out in all directions. Will PR make a difference? Well, I mean, I think we can see in Western European countries that a politics of anger has sold in some of those PR using countries. Absolutely. Just like here, our Conservative Party today seems angrier than in the past. The difference is that under PR, you only get what you've got coming. You can't turn those votes into anything more than what those votes amount to proportionately. And that's the check. I worry about anger and the tone of politics around the world. But the beauty of a PR system is that at the end of the election, a deal's got to be made. And often the angry types don't make it in, I mean, depending on what kind of anger it is. I mean, I think a lot of people are angry about the recent overturning of Roe versus Wade in the United States. That's a different kind of anger than the kind of anger that is lashing out at immigrants or lashing out at the disadvantaged. So yeah, I mean, I think that that's an important distinction. I worry that an angry party in the Canadian or British or American context can gain a disproportionate amount of influence over our political system. That certainly worries me.
Yeah. So I have another question here. Would PR, would they make parties have to appeal to more voters? The person's talking about right now the strategy of the mainstream parties to micro-target people. And they're wondering, how does that compare to parties, how they behave in a proportional system?
This is a really interesting question. And what we've seen historically, the argument about our political system was that it was supposed to be about brokerage parties, and that these brokerage parties were supposed to reach across our differences and bring them into coalitions. And this is the way that we would avoid anger and people beating up on different kinds of minorities. It was never entirely true that that's the way the system worked. A lot of people were left out. Canadian history is replete with the violation of minority rights, not the least of which, of course, was the retraction of Asian and South Asian Canadian voting rights for a period of 40, 50, 60 years in some cases, Indigenous voting rights. And so, our system was not a protection against that kind of bad behavior, but those were the arguments. The arguments were that these brokerage parties would bring everybody in, and well, that's not been occurring. What we've seen with the decline in voter turnout is that some parties actually like it that way. They don't want everyone to come out to vote, certainly not those who are not really motivated. And so the Republican Party pioneered this approach where basically you act on voter suppression to try to keep people away from the polls because your voters will come because they're dogged. And then you throw red meat at your own supporters to mobilize them to come out to vote. Now, in a way, our arguments around PR sound similar because we say that part of the problem currently is that too many people are left out of the political system. Nobody's talking to them. People can't make their vote count because of where they live. Or because of the popularity of some other views, their own minority view is completely expunged. And we sound like we're saying, well, yeah, we're going to make a place for you. But it's not the same. It's not the same because the beauty of the current system is that it's the twofold approach, right? Voter suppression plus targeting things, to your base. You don't want to reach out, right? You just want to mobilize your base. In a PR system, the incentives change. Now, it would be stupid for a party not to try to mobilize voters across the country. It would be wrong for a party to give up on different regions of the country, which is what they do now, right? Right now, conservatives say, downtown Toronto, who cares? We're never going to elect anybody there. But under a PR system, those downtown Toronto votes would suddenly matter. And the same would be true for all the other parties. So this was my argument around PR, is the PR ultimately would be a more inclusive system because it would make votes count no matter where they're cast. And that would create an incentive for parties to make some effort to speak to people all across the country.
Well, I'd also say, Dennis, I'm not sure what you would think about this. We might get a different quality of candidates running in a proportional system because right now I think a lot of people don't want to run if they know the party they would be taking 6 weeks off of work and spending all their time campaigning for, like they have absolutely zero chance of getting elected. I would think that we might have not just more choice, but maybe a little bit more quality in our choices as well. But I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I mean, one of the barriers to election today is the cost. Very few people can really afford to take off the time that is required to become a candidate, particularly because ridings keep getting bigger and bigger, not just geographically, but in terms of the number of people that exist within each riding. The more people you have in a riding, the more doors you got to knock on, the harder it is. And so what that means is that when we look at the kinds of people who get elected in our system, they tend to be upper middle class professionals, lawyers, doctors. In some cases, they might be business people, though business people usually just want someone else to do that work. So whereas, we don't see working class people, we don't see people from more modest backgrounds, which wasn't always the case. If we go back to the period up to the 1970s, we did have parties that made electing average people more of a priority. The Labour Party, up until the 1970s, had a significant number of their MPs who came from very working class backgrounds. I think we lose something by not having those people present. If we know anything from the women's movement, it's that the politics of presence matters. Having more women elected and present in a legislature makes a difference. And of course, that's true for all other groups as well.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a few people who are asking about proportional systems without getting too far into the weeds. They want to know what PR systems you recommend.
Well, I'm going to disappoint people because, one of the things that we notice here at Fair Vote Canada, after a number of decades in the biz, is that a lot of people come to the issue who are really interested in the details of the systems. And that's great. We need people who want to be expert and want to look into the minutia of the topic. But most people, of course, are big picture. And in terms of the impact of the system, it's the big picture that matters. People get hot and bothered about their particular choice of PR, which system, but really the most important factors in the adoption of a PR system is that the overall results will be broadly proportional. That's the most important thing. And the two things that any PR system that meets the first criteria will do is it will more effectively represent the diversity of views and the diversity of people that exist in a polity, and it will break the back of the phony majority governments that dominate and control power and then suborn politics to their veto players. So any PR system will do that, and that's the goal. I mean, if you like STV over MMP, great, but either one will do the job. And in looking at this topic over 150 years, looking at 18 Western industrialized countries, so looking at the pattern of governance over a very long period of time, I think I'm in a position to say that the details of the systems are much less important than that basic difference, that basic crucial factor that no one party can gain total control over what's going on. Some people have come out with really interesting new models that they suggest would work very well in Canada. And I'm glad to see that. That's exciting. And I would love to see some experts weigh in on, how would we do it and how would it work? Yeah, absolutely. Let's bring as many voices in as possible. But the fact is there's some off-the-shelf models that'll probably do the job too, right? Mixed member proportional, SDV, these are tried and true systems. They work. And they would work just as well in Canada if we put the effort into crafting them for our particular circumstances.
Can you comment, Dennis, on, I've got one question. I'm going to try to tie a few things together here. So I've got people asking, yeah, but how are the people picked? How do you, is it a closed party list, which relates to the theme of too much power for political parties, which I'm going to tie into somebody had a question about corruption.
Okay, great. You guys are you're on fire tonight. These are great questions, and you are hitting all the key themes that we have heard throughout our decades-long fight to bring a more democratic system to Canada. So yeah, people are concerned. They have concerns about the way political parties operate. Are they operating democratically? Well, the first thing I would say is that when we look at changes that have occurred in PR systems, they've usually not come because we've been able to think through every problem from the outset and then fix it, right? It's because the systems are competitive. As new problems and new challenges emerge, PR systems better accommodate them, right? They're more open, so that means that things can get on the agenda, right? The agenda control isn't so tight as it is in our system. People can put things on the table and say, we should talk about this. And then because the system is competitive, when someone puts a new issue on the table, it means that sometimes that forces other parties to go, oh, wow, look, party X is really getting some play on this topic. We should pay attention to that topic. So we get a contagion effect in the political system because it's more competitive. But to get to your specific issue, yeah, this came up in the context of New Zealand, where they were saying, all right, we're going to move in this mixed member proportional approach. That's what people indicated on the indicative referendum that we held, which we hoped would, derail this process, but whoops, it didn't. And so they said, but the thing that came out again and again was they didn't like the idea that parties could just make up their own mind about whether or not they would have any kind of internal process to choose their candidates. Now, spoiler, historically, conservatives didn't care that much. And left-wing parties tended to be more democratic in terms of having a process for choosing their members. But interestingly, the happy ending was that as left-wing parties moved to democratic processes, it usually moved the right-wing parties to follow suit. New Zealand just said, forget it, everyone's going to do it democratically. And they built it right into the rules. And so if that's people's concern, if people think that we need to make that a priority, we can do it. It's easy to do. We could put it right in the rules. The parties have to have some kind of transparent, open process that everyone can see how the people are chosen and where they get ranked on the list if the system has a list.
Right. So I just want to jump in and say that for a very long time now, Fair Vote Canada has not supported any systems that have what's called closed lists. So that means the party decides who's on the list and you just vote for a party and then whoever's on their list gets elected. We don't support that. And there's not too many people in Canada that find that highly appealing just simply because people don't trust political parties. So the systems that we advocate for, you would be directly electing individuals, whether that's through a ranked ballot with single transferable vote, or whether that's on an open list with mixed member proportional. You'd be picking individuals, and the most popular individuals are the ones that will be elected. So a lot of that stuff is a little bit of fear mongering that's still going on from opponents about the power of political parties or giving more power to voters. Somebody's asking, how do you respond to people that say proportional representation results in backroom deals?
Well, I don't really understand the claim, because it's our system is the backroom deal party. Our system is the one where everything happens in the smoke-filled rooms and we have no access to it. In fact, the theorists of the brokerage party, they applaud that. They say, this is great. You know, people join a party, which, you know, is not necessarily transparent. And then they make all the decisions about how to fix our problems. And they come out, you know, with some ideas, but we don't see how the sausage is made. Now, that's very different than a PR system. In a PR system, it's very much out in the open. I mean, in some cases, it's quite blatant, right? So if you look at different countries, different Western European countries, in some cases, parties make their deal available to the public before the election even takes place, right? They say, look, if you vote for us, we plan to work with this party and this party, of course, depending on your will as the voters. I mean, you know, if you don't elect any of them, then we can't work with them. But, you know, if you elect this group of parties, we are going to work together. And here's the priorities that we're going to work on. But even in PR systems where that isn't the custom, and of course, customs matter in terms of how these develop over time, the fact is that they have to have a process where they work out what is going to be the deal. At some point, the deal has to be put on the table. And unlike our system, voters have real options in proportional systems. They don't like the deal. If they think their party is not moving in the right direction, they can punish them. More realistically, let me give you one quick example. In Sweden in the 1990s, the long-standing dominant left-wing party was starting to move to the right, starting to adopt policies that historically many of their supporters didn't really like. What happened in the next election was a significant group of voters said, okay, fine, you're not going to act like the party we thought you were. We're going to vote for this other left-wing party. And this had the effect of pulling the larger left-wing party back to some of those supporters. Why? Because there was a price to be paid. They lost some support. They could see where those votes went. In other words, the voters could make their wishes known. Now, of course, that party could have made other choices. It could have decided to join with other parties in the center. Who knows? But my point is just that under PR systems, it's easier to read what the votes mean, and the parties actually have to put their stuff on the table much more than they have to do in our system.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the idea of big tents. I often hear, like I've heard from Justin Trudeau, for example, the idea that the big tent is better. It's like all the diversity of Canada can just fit into the big red tent. Why do we need to have separate parties? But separate parties make things more transparent. They give us more choice, and then they make the deal making more transparent. You know what you're voting for. And like you said, Dennis, it's easier to hold them accountable when it's not this like giant blob.
Well, who runs the big tent? You know, who controls what goes on in the big tent? I mean, we know from analyzing power dynamics that, you know, group dynamics in a group, sometimes dominant personalities can define the character of the discussion, or maybe things don't even get raised because people sense that it's not appropriate. Who are the veto players and the power blocks within this party? We don't often know. So the big tent idea is just a recipe for bullying.
Yeah, it gives a small group of people around the prime minister a whole lot of power. Okay, so I have a few people asking you to comment on the recent Ontario election. There's different ways they're asking you to comment. Somebody's saying, you know, the Liberals got so few seats and they actually got more vote than the NDP, but Stephen Del Duca had to resign. Do you have comments in general on the results of the Ontario election?
Well, I mean, there's some interesting, minutia if you read the tea leaves of the election a bit more closely. I mean, what was interesting was how the PCs got more seats by getting fewer votes. In fact, the votes they got this time were similar to the votes that the NDP got last time. And of course, that only amounted to the opposition for the NDP. But this time, it's not only the government, but it's even more seats. I mean, if the election is a communication device, then the communication is getting lost. It's not clear that the decline in votes is sending the message that people really intended to get across. Of course, what came through was that Ontarians don't agree on what alternative to Doug Ford they want. And why should they have to? Why, this focus again on stability, the sky will fall if one party doesn't get all the power. I don't know, that sounds kind of self-interested to me. It sounds to me like people who want to have the year of government are worried that they might be shut out if one party doesn't end up in power and they can't buy their way to the front of the line. So, but the bottom line is that we've had 2 elections now where a clear majority of Ontarians have rejected the Conservative Party. Now, maybe the Conservatives could work with the Liberals. I mean, there often is vote switching between Liberals and Conservatives, much more so than there is between Liberals and NDP, though you might not know that. So yeah, I mean, the end result of the Ontario election is that many fewer people participated. The Liberals came through the election with a similar amount of votes than they had in the last election, which was much better than the NDP, who lost a considerable amount of support. But nonetheless, the voting system, because of its functioning, didn't reflect what voters said with their votes. And of course, going forward, that doesn't send a very good message, right? People are struggling to be heard. And that's fairly clear with the election results. So I don't have anything more to say than I think a lot of other armchair theorists have said. It may condition the Liberals to be more open to voting system reform. I mean, here, going back to an earlier question, what will motivate change? One of the things we know from studying voting system reform is when a traditional ruling party thinks that it will never get power again, they become more open to voting system reform. And that's in part because they can't pay off any of their supporters if they can't ever get a piece of power. And so that could be something, right? As long as Liberals think they're just a few votes away from getting back into power, well, the intoxicating effect of majority government is too much to give up. But if the Liberals start to say, wow, this system seems rigged against us, and of course they did open the door to voting system reform. I mean, they ran in the last campaign saying they were just going to change the system. So why don't they just commit to changing the system to one that would be more accurate and honest? Rather than the one that was going to help them as a party. I think there's an opening here for people to put pressure on the Liberals to do the right thing, make every vote count. It would be in the best interest of Liberal voters, and it would be in the best interest of the people of Ontario.
Yeah. Okay, one more question here around systems. So this person is asking you to address one of the myths that came up in the response in the Toronto Star from the Fraser Institute about how PR will give people in cities so much more power compared to people in rural area, according to them.
This is what we call in the trade garbage arguments. They're garbage arguments because they rely on nothing. Nothing. There's no evidence. They've never provided any kind of evidence to support this claim. Here's the most basic thing that you need to understand. They are trying to say that there are 2 groups of voters, urban voters and rural voters, and they have distinctly different interests. And the terrifying thing in the tyranny of the majority is that this majority population in urban areas will wield their majority to oppress those people in rural areas. I mean, it's a terrifying story. It would make a great movie, but it's just not true. It doesn't match what people actually do. Let's look inside the box, right? If you look in urban areas, does everybody vote for one party? Is that what occurs in an election? Does everybody say, hey, let's vote for the urban party and screw those rural people? No, not at all. In fact, when we look at rural areas and we look at urban areas, what we discover is that people are divided in their political choices. And what that means is that they're also divided about the policy choices that they support. So when we talk about this rural versus urban, it's a fantasy because rural people themselves don't agree on what the policy choices are to fix and address rural problems. And overrepresenting their views or not representing the total views fairly is actually doing them a disservice because in no place is there just a rural party. All our parties are coalitions of rural and urban voters. And so when people vote in a rural area for one of the major parties, what they're saying is, I'm supporting the policy mix of this party. They would be better served by seeing the votes of that party maximized in a PR system, because there is no one rural view. There is no one rural set of solutions. In fact, within rural areas, there are ferocious disagreements. just like in urban areas. So I find this argument just so silly and stupid because there's really no facts to back it up. There is no rural thing that's being represented. There is no urban thing that's being represented. When we look at what actually happens in elections, people vote for different parties in both of those spaces.
Yeah. And this is one of the most frustrating things, is that fact-free assertions carry equal or more weight to the things that are actually true. Somebody was saying, well, why did the referendum fail? Like they sort of, a little recap, people vote based on what they hear. They don't know what's true. They don't know what's false. They're not clear when the parties are saying things just because it's in their self-interest to say it, as opposed to it being true. And it's really hard to sort out and get people's attention.
I find it hard to believe that groups like the Fraser Institute, in an appropriate, fact-based media universe, could get any space to talk, because they so obviously put their conclusions ahead of their research and fact-finding. I mean, they so obviously have an agenda that and then they fit all the pieces to support that agenda. So, I mean, people have to take what the Fraser Institute say with a grain of salt, a big, very big grain of salt.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a question. People asking, since we're on our last 9 minutes here, what are the opportunities coming up? What can people do? So, do you want to talk about part of that? And I can talk about part of that, Dennis. Like, what do you see that we can do in the next few years at various levels?
Well, first, I want to say, I haven't been able to look at all your questions tonight because I've been concentrating on trying to focus on the question that is coming and then, give it my best answer. But wow, you guys are asking amazing questions, like, really smart stuff. Excellent. This is really excellent. I'm disappointed that I can't, answer each one and engage with you. I would love to. As I say, follow up with me if you'd like. I've been working on this issue for 33 years, right? Almost 33 and a third years, echoing my former broadcasting DJ career. And my very first presentation on this was to the Royal Commission on Electoral Reform and Party Financing back in 1989, where I said that Canada needed a proportional voting system. And at the time, the commentators, who were all political hacks, right? They were all appointed by the parties because they were good party supporters. They all laughed, what rubbish? Why should we listen to you? This is a silly idea. And they raised all of the kind of bogus arguments that we hear. Well, 33 years later, things have changed. It's much harder for people to laugh off this topic. And believe me, as much as we hear the groans and we hear the complaints and the National Post comes out and says, oh, you're a bunch of poor sports for raising this issue, but they worry. They worry that this issue will somehow take off and then we'll end up with a New Zealand situation where it's unstoppable. So all I can say to you is that we all have to just keep doing what we're doing, right? We have to keep trying to educate, but don't think that education is necessarily going to do the job. We all have to be aware of the politics of what's going on. We're not dealing with people who are dealing with us in good faith, okay? They're about winning. They're about keeping power, and they will do anything to keep it and win it, including lying, distorting, prevaricating, backing out of a deal, whatever. So we've got to get up to the grown-up table here and face the facts that this is a dogfight about democracy. And that's really where we need to make the appeal to people. Do you feel powerful? Do you feel like you're being heard? Because I think we could do better. I'm not saying PR will solve all our problems, but it might change the game, right? It might alter who's at the table. It could change the tone of the conversation. And all of those things would be a good thing. So I don't have any magic crystal ball. I've seen a lot of stuff go down. All I can say is, please keep doing what you're doing. Keep trying to raise the issue. Keep looking for opportunities to connect what people are already doing to us, right? There's lots of people out there fighting good fights. And what we want to say to them, hey, lend just a little bit of your energy to our issue. Include our issue, right? Because the things you're fighting for are often you're fighting for them because you're not being heard. You're not being seen. And our issue is all about being heard and being seen. And so I think we can try to make appeals to people and broaden the tent that can continue to mobilize around this fight.
Yeah. So I want to reinforce what Dennis says. So Fair Vote Canada has grown an incredible amount in the 21 years since a couple of people met in a kitchen or a basement and said, let's do it. But we're not big enough to do this on our own. So what Dennis was saying, we don't want to own this issue, even though we are the main vehicle right now to organize and mobilize people. We want every group with an issue to own this issue. And the way that they will do that is when they're hearing from their own members, this is important, not when they're hearing, well, Fair Vote Canada has it in the bag. There's already a group for that. We want to see PR worked into every group that has an issue. The other thing I wanted to bring anybody up to speed who is new. So last year in the last Parliament, we won a vote at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee that we worked on for a very long time. And those of you who knew are going to chuckle here. We won a vote to do a study of a citizens' assembly on electoral reform. Dennis is laughing. This was huge for us because the Liberals on the committee voted yes. And those of you on this call and thousands of people across Canada put a huge amount of effort to win that vote. And if Justin Trudeau had not called the snap election, that study might have already been happening right now to talk about the idea of having a citizens' assembly. So we will be back in this Parliament trying to win that vote again on the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. Well, whether we will get the Liberals on board this time or whether we will get the Conservatives on board this time remains to be seen, because as you all know, the Conservatives are having a wee few problems in their big tent right now, where some of them don't like each other very much. And there is a serious conversation going on that we can't see, I can guarantee it, about proportional representation right about now. And that will probably intensify once whoever wins the leadership is solidified. So we have angles that we can push the Liberals on. We have angles we can push the Conservatives on. We have a huge opportunity again here in Ontario with 2 leaderless parties and 2 party leader races coming up to identify and help support leaders of those parties who are in favor of a citizens' assembly, are in favor of proportional representation. There's so many opportunities coming up to help Fair Vote Canada. Dennis, did you see one more that you wanted to?
You know, as I can only once again say that I'm disappointed that I wasn't able to respond to them all, but I do encourage you, if you want to email me, dpilon@yorku.ca, or you look me up institutionally at York. I'm a chatty guy. I'm happy to email you and direct you to anything. And you don't even have to agree with me. I get lots of people who come at me with lots of interesting views. The important thing is that you're out there doing your work. I'm trying to, do my bit, which is to provide some resources to keep this fight going forward. But we're never going to win it on the basis of facts. We're going to win it by getting people to see that this is the way forward. Out of the democratic crisis that is increasingly becoming worse. And so a lot of it is going to be about emotion. It's going to be about values, but the values are going to be about democracy. That's really it. Everything else comes after, right? I can give you the facts to squash, a lot of bad arguments, but ultimately, I guess the last thing I want to say is, don't be afraid to cut your losses with some people. There are some people who are not engaging with us, in a fair discussion, an honest discussion. And you need to put your energy into places where people who want to hear this message and would benefit from this message are present.